The topic of this lecture is on baby statistics. In the text, these are called transitional probabilities. And the reason they're called transitional probabilities is because the infants are computing the probability that certain transitions will occur between or across syllables. So sometimes the probability that two syllables will occur side by side is very high. And sometimes the probability that two syllables will occur together is very low. And if the probability is very high, that means they belong together. And so the baby kind of groups them together as a word. And if the probability is very low that two syllables will go side by side, then the baby assumes that this is a transition between words, that they don't belong together all the time. So this must be a break between words. I'm going to give you an example here of how these babies are computing statistics. So you can imagine that a mother is speaking to her infant, and in that motherly parenty voice, she says something like, "Look at our little Joey, he's such a pretty baby. Oh goodness, isn't this Joey such a pretty little baby? We love this Joey baby the most because he's our little Joey and no one else's. Oh, what a little love he is." I've chosen to represent this speech the way the baby hears it, without any breaks between the words. The baby's goal is to figure out where the breaks are, which parts are words of their own, and which parts are combined with the ones next to them. Now, first of all, most of the words here are a single syllable. Some researchers have estimated that around 70% of English words are monosyllabic. So if babies just default to the assumption that each syllable they hear is a single word of its own, that's actually a really good place to start. And indeed, many of these words in this utterance here appear multiple times. Notice here that we've got our and our, we've got such and such, a and a, this and this, love and love. And so you can see that these words are appearing multiple times. Notice as well that the surrounding words are different each time. The things that occur around the word our are at and little. Here it's he's and little. So there's a different word at the outset of our here and here. You've got such a that occurs a couple times, right? But before the word such, you've got he's and you've got Joey. Before and after the word this, we've got isn't and Joey, and here we've got love and Joey. And both times the word O appeared, there was a break before it already in the natural sequence of things. The parent might have kind of paused for a moment before uttering the ejaculation O. You can see here that the word a begins with such and ends with pretty. Here it's what and little. So you can see that sometimes the words that surround an utterance, a single syllable, a word, are different and sometimes they're the same, but they're not reliably the same even when they are the same. They're not always the same. They're just often the same. So the baby can begin to get used to these sounds occurring regularly in speech and assume that these are units of their own, that these are words. But sometimes the infant will hear two syllables that are said together with surprising frequency. This baby never hears Joe without E. Joey. They always go together. In this sample of speech, at least, and in reality, you might say they almost always go together. Somebody might say Joe instead of Joey, but most of the time this infant will hear Joey together. This baby also hears lit and ol, little, always together. In this sample of speech, lit never appears alone. It always has ol after it. Little, always. Same for baby and pretty. But notice for each of these examples that the sounds on either side of the two-syllable words are not consistent. Sometimes the sound pretty is followed by bay, pretty bay, and sometimes it's followed by lit, pretty lit. So that's a clue for the infant to know that pretty is a word, that those two syllables go together. But whatever comes after it is not part of that same unit because it's not always the same. Pretty always goes together, but sometimes it's followed by a sound like bay and sometimes by a sound lit, and if the speech kept going on, you'd hear other words too follow pretty. Pretty shelf, pretty bottle, pretty anything. It could be anything described as pretty. And this is the same with the word little. Sometimes the sound that comes after little is Joe, sometimes bay, so you can see Joe and bay, and again here it's Joe once more, but here it's la for love, right? And so each time it's each time it's a different sound that follows little, and even when the sound that follows little sometimes repeats, like Joe might come after little more than once, but even then it's not 100%. The probability of hearing lit and ol together is 100%, at least in these few short sentences. In real life it's probably not 100%, because you could say like lit the candle or litter, something like that, but think about it for a second. Can you think of any other words that start with lit and end in something else? Like, that's pretty much it. Lit the as two different words, or litter, little, anything else? I can't think of any. So the probability of the word ending with little is very high, nearly 100%. And that means that those two parts are probably a word, a unit of their own. They go together. And the sound that comes before and the sound that comes after don't go with it. And so that's where we know those are the breaks. Little goes together, but then there's a break before whatever comes after that. Little is a word, and then there's a break before whatever's after that. With just a few rounds of sentences like this, the baby can recognize the word boundaries that separate so many of these words. So I'm just going to underline everything so far that we've talked about because they're a single syllable or because they're double syllables and they appear multiple times and each time they appear together if they're two syllables, but then the sound that comes after it is not the same. So here are all the different words that can be segmented from this speech. And all of a sudden, the baby can segment all these words out of the constant stream of speech. He hasn't mastered all of them, but how much more decoded is this than it was when he started? And imagine if he has another 2 minutes of this, or 10 minutes of this. Pretty soon he's going to know most of the word boundaries. He still won't know what these words mean, but if they're used often enough in connection with the nouns or verbs that they're supposed to represent, pretty soon he'll start to learn the meanings of each of these words as well. And that process is what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. So now you can see why infants can segment nonsense words from a made-up language after listening to just 2 minutes of speech, as you read in your text. Bid, for instance, is always followed by aku. Bid aku always goes together. But what comes after aku? Sometimes it's goal, sometimes it's dut, again dut, sometimes it's pad, again we see a pad. But it's not consistent. So that means bid and aku are a word. And there's a break after that. There's always going to be a break after that because these two go together, but the inconsistencies of what follow that, the low probability of this syllable transitioning from aku, is suggesting that there's a break here. They're separate. And so the infants can follow the same logic. You can see this that we start breaking after the word bidaku, 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 and you can see then that the infant might follow that same logic for all the other words in this stream of speech. And all of a sudden you have a series of individual 3-syllable words: bidaku, golabu, dutaba, golabu. So you hear these same words repeated over and over again. Golabu, golabu, golabu. And so the point here is that after 2 minutes of listening to this speech, these 2 syllables always go together. These 2 syllables always go together. These two always go together. But the probability that for instance, abu and pad go together, abu pad, that's only very infrequently. That's only like a third of the time do those two syllables go together. That means that when infants hear in a later experimental or test phase of an experiment, if they hear a sound like abu pad, then they're more surprised by that and interested in hearing that new word. And they stare at the speaker that's giving that new word for a longer time because they think that's a new word. That's not something that they've heard before. Abu pad is not actually a word in this fake language. And so if that's a word repeated by the speaker, abu pad, abu pad, abu pad, then the infant is going to be very interested in that because they think they're learning a new word. But since infants don't yet know what virtually any words mean in even their native language English, these nonsense words here are just as valid to them as words like pretty and little and baby, because all they're doing right now is trying to separate the words. They're trying to find where do the words break and what are the syllables that go together to create words and where are the separations. And later they're going to be learning what do these individual units that are called, that we can think of as words, what do they mean? And that's, again, what we're going to be talking about tomorrow.